In late 2019, Honda came out with a brand new revised version of the Africa Twin. We got a new engine, a new frame, and a load of new tech. This is the review of the 2020 Africa Twin 1100 Standard. When Honda bought the original Africa Twin out, they came out swinging. That bike did really well. It sold in good numbers. The people that bought them really liked them. It built a really good fan base around it, and generally it got really good reviews. It won our mid-size adventure bike shootout, but for us, it wasn't a perfect bike. It definitely had some things that could be improved. So Honda have gone back and kind of started redeveloping it a little bit. They've changed some quite dramatic things. The first and one of the most interesting things that Honda have changed is in the direction in which they've pushed their models of this bike. In the UK, you can buy 3 versions. So you can buy the Honda Africa Twin Standard, they do a kind of Standard Plus version, and they do an Adventure Sports version. And the marketing behind those 3 bikes is really different. In this test, we've got the 1100 Standard, which Honda are promoting as their off-road version of this bike. It's their most extreme bike, it's their lightest, and they've made a few modifications to it to make it more off-road friendly. The Adventure Sports version, which is kind of much more going at the GS Adventure, KTM Super Adventure market, is designed for adventure touring, or at least that's what their marketing says. You can spec that with electronic suspension, and it's got a taller screen and huge fuel range, and they pitch it as a bike that's comfortable and good for riding long miles on. One of the trends we've seen a lot over the last 18 months is bikes becoming more focused. So bikes are getting lighter, they're becoming more deliberate in the direction and the design, and less of an overall package than maybe they used to be. With that focusing in direction, Honda have made some significant changes to the Africa Twin. They've lopped the top off the screen on the standard model so that it interferes less with you when you're riding off-road. They've also changed the frame so that the new one is lighter, it's a slightly different shape, it's definitely lost some weight in there as well, and they've paired that with a swing arm, which is very similar to the swing arm off their CRF 450R motocross bike. For people that are keen off-roaders, and this was definitely a little bit of a flaw in the original Africa Twin, Honda have now gone to a detachable subframe. That means that if you crash and you bend your subframe, it's not such a big deal. The last touch for off-road riding is that they've changed the riding position slightly from the previous Africa Twin to make it better in theory for standing up and riding off-road. On the spec sheet, Honda have done a good job. They've done what every manufacturer needs to do when they bring a new bike out. They made it faster and they made it lighter. And I think they should be applauded for that. On top of that, they've also added in a whole new tech package. So there's a new 6-axis IMU, which should in theory be able to provide better ABS and better traction control. And that's paired with a TFT screen that offers an insane amount of functionality. And one of the other headline figures is Apple CarPlay. So if you're an iPhone user, you can really easily pair your iPhone to your bike. On road, that Africa Twin, when it came out, was a little bit of a revolution because it was the first 21-inch front wheel bike that felt that good on the road. It was really Honda. It was consistent, it handled well, it was pleasant to ride, you could hustle it along, and for a 21-inch front wheel bike, it had a lot of confidence. For people that enjoyed their original Africa Twin, you're going to be really happy with the new bike because it has a lot of those same characteristics. For me, the most noticeable improvement on the road comes in the engine. The outgoing motor isn't a bad road engine at all. It pulls hard, but the new one feels like that little bump has just given it a little extra something it didn't have before. You can now carry a taller gear, you can pull much harder from corner to corner, it'll do little power wheelies out of corners, and generally I think that side of the engine is something that's going to make you smile. It's not torquey to the point that, say, an R1250 GS is torquey. It's not going to melt your brain in the way that some of the bigger 1200s, the 1260 KTM does. But if you like a torquey engine, you like to pull gears, you like to really roll on and be smooth with the engine, you're going to really enjoy this bike. I'm not saying it doesn't have top end, but for me, it worked better when you were lower in the revs and you kind of use that to its advantage. On the new Africa Twin, you can't really talk about any part of it without coming back to the electronics in some way. The new package gives you a lot more control over different areas of the bike. We've got modes all the way through the bike that have different settings for the throttle, power delivery, for the engine braking, ABS, and traction control. In your user modes, you can then adjust those up and down to create settings that you like. But within that, the adjustment is really important. There's two things that I noticed with the Africa Twin that for me as a personal trait, I'm not a big fan of. The first is, I think the roll on the throttle was pretty abrupt. So when you roll on in a corner from zero throttle, it hits quite hard and it kind of upset the bike quite a lot. And the same when you roll off the throttle, it's not smooth all the way to zero. It gets to a point and it just cuts the fueling and it causes the bike to dive and load up the front wheel a lot because it has a lot of engine braking. We spent a lot of time testing this and trying to get the right setting, and eventually we got a setting where we liked how everything was working a little bit more. But in standard riding modes like touring, everything is too abrupt. The power's abrupt, the engine braking is just not quite right, and it upsets the bike a lot. By the end of the test, I had definitely figured out how to ride the Africa Twin and got comfortable with it, but it's something that I think you need to figure out. You need to play with those settings to get right because there's a little bit of a learning curve there. When it comes to handling on the road, I think Honda are in a similar position to where they are with the engine. For me, the Honda is a bike that responds a lot to setup, and where some bikes don't care and they'll just handle the same consistently whether you change things or not, the way the Honda is that if the setup isn't quite right or the setup is really on point, you get a very different riding experience. When we received the Honda, something didn't feel quite right. It wasn't a bike that I immediately got on with and gelled and felt comfortable with because the handling characteristics were a little bit off. It had this kind of scenario where it felt really long, it felt really raked out, and so when you tried to tip into corners, it was a little bit sluggish, and then when it did tip over, it dropped, and it felt like you weren't getting a lot of feedback from the rear wheel. We went about trying to rectify that. We added some more preload, and it wasn't great. It didn't make a huge difference. So then we moved the forks through the clamps, and we started to get somewhere. The bike felt a little bit tighter, you got a lot better feedback from the front wheel, and just the whole characteristic of the bike changed dramatically. And it was something that I started to really enjoy riding on the road. It turned well, it turned neutral, it was a really consistent ride after that, and generally just a much more enjoyable bike to ride. In terms of handling, it doesn't tip into corners particularly quickly, it doesn't do it slowly, it's just very middle of the road, consistent, and typically very Honda. I don't think you're ever going to get off this bike, phone your mates up and be like, this is the best bike I've ever ridden, the handling is phenomenal. But for a bike with a 21-inch front wheel, it's very composed and it does what you want it to do. It doesn't really feel alive in the same way as some other bikes do. It doesn't have that kind of feeling like you're going fast, but then all of a sudden you'll be carrying a lot of speed through corners, making really good progress and keeping up with people that feel like they're on the edge of their ability, but in a really composed and chilled out way. When you turn the Africa Twin from the street onto the dirt, it's a really interesting experience. Firstly, the new bike is better than the old bike. The weight is instantly noticeable. It feels lighter to ride because it is lighter to ride. On top of that, the new engine is a better engine. That increase in torque means you can ride flowy trails a little bit smoother, you can carry your speed better, you can run a taller gear, and it kind of doesn't have a problem with it. However, there are definitely some things where everything's a little bit at odds. The marketing for this bike suggests that it's a really hardcore off-road adventure bike, but when you ride it, that experience is maybe a little bit different. Firstly, that really comes to light in the change in riding position of the Africa Twin. Honda have most notably fitted some really big bar risers, the kind that used to be on the Adventure Sports model. They seem to be on all of the bikes now, and that big riser creates a really interesting riding position. The gap between the foot pegs and the handlebars is quite narrow, it's very upright, and with the big handlebar riser, even for someone quite tall like myself, it's an extremely upright riding position. It means it's also very comfortable when you're riding stood up in a neutral position for a very long time. Smashing out long miles on dirt roads, big flowy dirt roads, it's incredibly comfortable to ride. However, when you start to go into more technical environments and you need to move around more, or if you start to push the pace a little bit more, being in such a static upright position means you start to use a lot of energy to ride. So when you need to move your body weight forwards, say you've got a nice steep uphill, the Africa Twin feels awkward. It feels cramped. It feels like you have to use a lot of your kind of lat and back strength to hold yourself in place in the way that you just don't have to on other bikes. So it kind of comes down to what type of riding you want to do. If you're just out cruising, riding mellow adventure stuff, this bike's incredibly comfortable. And if you're not, I think you're going to find that it's a little bit of a fight in that situation. The balance of the bike is the same. If you keep the Africa Twin in balance, it's a really balanced bike. You can ride single track on it and feel really comfortable with it. And when you try to do things like track stands and stop still, if you get it right, it feels awesome. It feels really balanced left to right. It's really easy to hold in that position until it's not. And when it's not, it suddenly feels like a really tall bike with a really high center of gravity. And I think ultimately that's because it is quite a tall bike with quite a high center of gravity. A little bit because of the suspension, where the suspension is quite plush and soft and it moves through the stroke quite freely and quite a long way. When you change the balance or you lose your balance a little bit or you have to put a foot down, the bike unloads and the suspension moves a lot, which changes the balance point, changes the height of the bike, and that immediately makes it feel a bit unwieldy. Because of that, when you get to the point in your technical riding where you run out of skills, it suddenly becomes a really big bike. It becomes a big bike in an unwieldy, top-heavy way, which isn't confidence-inspiring. Now, the interesting thing about this is I think this bike is going to be a very different riding experience depending on the type of riding you do. If you do kind of classic adventure riding where you're out, most of your riding's dirt roads, big dirt roads, and you're more worried about using that bike to cover distance, the Africa Twin's good. It ticks a lot of the boxes. I do think it's a little bit top heavy. It could benefit from having a slightly lower center of gravity. It would make it feel less unwieldy. But generally, for that type of riding, I think it's fantastic. If you're the kind of adventure rider that likes to get a little bit more technical into single track stuff, the Africa Twin has some limitations, and a lot of that is around that balance, that weight, and how the suspension responds to input.
Oi, oi, oi.
The suspension is plusher than a pit full of pillows. It's so soft. And for some people, that is going to be a dream. There's situations where I think the suspension actually worked fantastically well and much better than I was expecting it to. And there's situations where it was incredibly frustrating. If you're in that situation where you're doing a lot more touring riding, you're riding dirt roads with lots of little stutter bumps or small rocks, the Africa Twin's a comfortable bike. It's really nice. It covers that ground well. But the moment there's something a little bit sketchy involved or a vaguely big hit, it disappears through the stroke and it gets a little bit wild. If you're riding more technical, twisty dirt roads, there's a bit more braking and accelerating and changes of direction involved. It doesn't cope with that in the same way. Because it's soft, like on the road, it dives through the stroke really quickly, it comes back really quickly, it doesn't have a lot of bottoming resistance or kind of mid-range control. So what you use this bike for is going to determine a lot how your experience is. One of the most surprising moments with the Africa Twin was in a riverbed that we use quite a lot, especially when we're doing testing in Portugal. It's one of our favorite trails, and the Africa Twin, because it had plush suspension with very little deflection off rocks, was incredible in there. You could ride along that riverbed faster on the Africa Twin than I have ever ridden along there on any other adventure bike, because the rocks had very little input on the bike. The suspension has so much freedom to move that all those short, harsh impacts had no effect over it. So it was composed, planted, and it felt like the world was the limit until there's a hole. And then if you hit the hole, you have a problem. The last major talking point with the Africa Twin is the electronics package. Honda have really tried to drag the Africa Twin into the modern era by changing everything about the electronics. The Africa Twin has a really nice looking display. It's really, really pretty to look at, but it's a little bit on the complicated side. The menus are a little bit clunky, the switchgear is a little bit clunky, the kind of method that you do things isn't very intuitive in the same way that a lot of our user interfaces normally are. That starts with the kind of base settings that Honda have got in their display and in the way the menus work. For every mode, you have a different setup with the screen. So for touring mode, you have one setup where it shows a bunch of information, and then you go to urban mode and it shows you a whole bunch less information, and off-road mode, even less information. And at first it wasn't apparent at all that that was adjustable, that you could tweak how those menus worked. Now, as we spent a bit more time with it, and I read the manual a few times, I learned that you can change everything. But the way that you control all those systems takes reading the manual. It's not a system that I think you can just start using and figure out very quickly in the same way that KTM's system is, or to some extent BMW's system is. It definitely feels almost like a 90s Japanese computer game. You can't talk about electronics without talking about how the actual electronic aids fare. With an Africa Twin, you can't get away from them. They are part of the bike, they come on every bike, everyone has ABS and traction control now, and they're pretty good. They've definitely improved over the last bike. I like the traction control generally, and I like the ABS generally, but there are a few little negatives that I think some bikes with the Bosch-based system have figured out to a little bit of a better level. For me, the traction control, when it's on, kicks in a little bit too aggressively. So it kind of becomes hard when you're riding technical riding or the ground gets slippery to rely on it and leave it alone. On the KTMs and the BMWs, 95% of the time, unless you're doing very technical riding or you're riding in sand, you can leave the traction control off. But on the Honda, I generally found myself turning it off a bit sooner than I probably would on those bikes. The ABS, you can only turn off on the rear wheel. And I think Honda have done a really good job of improving the ABS, but it suffers a little bit from the same problem. It kicks in a little bit early, and for me, it kicks in a little bit too much. So I always found myself kind of riding with a bit more in reserve, just in case that ABS did something I wasn't expecting it to. Some of that, I believe, is probably because the front fork is very soft. So when you brake hard, the fork goes through the stroke quickly, hits a stiff point, and it pushes the front wheel a little bit. I'm not 100% sure on that, and you'd have to test it by running some stiffer fork settings internally to find out if that's true. If you're generally just using it for adventure style riding, the ABS is going to be fine. You're never going to have a problem with it. It's going to save your bacon if you're an earlier to off-road riding rider and you're making mistakes with the front brake. There's a couple of other little electronic bits that Honda have introduced. The cruise control is one. It is very effective. It does a really good job. It kicks in straight away, it holds the speed well, and is a really nice addition. I believe every Africa Twin comes with cruise control now because they have an electronic throttle, and that's a lovely thing. Anyone that's ridden with cruise control on a long highway, motorway ride understands that it's a great addition, and it's really going to make your touring experience a lot better. In conclusion, I think the Honda for some people is going to be the perfect bike. It does the whole mellow, kind of flowing adventure riding thing really damn well. And I found myself having a really good time on it a lot. I rode it differently to how I ride other adventure bikes. I spent a lot more time sat down on it than I normally would, but I really enjoyed riding it. It's a really good bike. And if it suits what you want to use it for, I think you'll quickly find a way to work around those little nitpicks and just get on with it and enjoy that bike a lot. For those of you that are looking for something a little bit more focused and you want to ride some more difficult off-road riding, the Africa Twin is maybe not the bike for you, or maybe it's a bike that you need to fettle. I think if you're a Honda fan, you could take this bike into your garage. You can drop some weight from it by changing the exhaust, fitting a lithium battery, and then making a few other considered changes to the suspension, and you can make this bike into something much, much different to what it is in standard trim. Whether this is the right bike for you and whether it represents good value, again, is going to completely come down to what you want from this bike. In the UK, it starts at £13,000, which has pushed the Africa Twin into a category of bikes that it definitely wasn't in before. Ultimately, Honda have made a good bike better than it was, but it's still not perfect. There's still other brands doing the things that Honda are trying to do better in isolation, and whether it works for you as a package is definitely just going to come down to what you want from it. Thanks for watching this video. If you like it and you've enjoyed watching it, please subscribe. We have adventure bike reviews all the time, and we produce loads of other adventure and dual sport style content. One of the main things we do is a podcast where we take deep dives into different subjects like how to finish the Dakar Rally, how to build the perfect adventure bike, and we run that through our Patreon page. For us, Patreon is one of the lifebloods of our channel, especially in these current times. It's helping us to keep paying our bills. And so if you're interested in that kind of subject, take a look at the link in the description below. We've also got some new merchandise for sale. I'm wearing one of those t-shirts right now. So if you've enjoyed this video, take a look at our merch section, drop a comment down below on what you think of this review, the Africa Twin, and what you'd like us to review next. And remember, life's better when you're riding.